Coming up on the Civil Discourse, engineering studies professor and pioneer Dr. Donna Riley addresses ways to reframe a historically male-dominated and uninflectedly applied field and how it can better respond to a new generation of students.
So the climate crisis is the thing that comes up immediately for me. We've got about 10 years to seriously do something, and it requires fundamentally changing aspects of our infrastructure. Engineers have to be involved in the response to climate. And we can be involved preventively or we can be involved in disaster response, but either way, engineers are going to be involved.
Hello and welcome to the Civil Discourse. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the College of Engineering at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Dr. Donna Riley, Kamiyar Hagigi Head of the School of Engineering Education at Purdue University. Dr. Riley is a pioneer in her discipline, challenging traditional notions of engineering as a male-dominated, uninflectedly applied field. Her books, Engineering and Social Justice and Engineering Thermodynamics and 21st Century Energy Problems, address how the field can be reformed and made more responsive to a new generation of students. Donna Riley, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about your background. What was it in your upbringing, in your family life, that drew you to the engineering discipline and to this concentration?
Sure. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and one of the things that struck me as a child was, first of all, we had smog alerts in my elementary school. So there were times when we couldn't play, and it wasn't snow days like we have on the East Coast, it was smog days, and the air was so unhealthful that we couldn't go outside and play. Meanwhile, my family would take me on trips around California, so I would see places like Yosemite National Park or even the mountains locally in Southern California, and I was struck by how beautiful California is, and I wanted to work on environmental problems from early on. And as I got into high school, I started to think about college and how I might be able to address environmental problems. I thought about environmental studies was not yet fully formed. I was looking at places that might have it, but most colleges and universities didn't have it yet. And I thought about policy as preparation for environmental law. And my father was a chemical engineer. So
that makes a difference.
Yes. So he said, what about engineering? And I remember this very clearly, I went to a girls' high school in Pasadena, California, and I went to my college counselor and said, my dad suggested engineering, what do you think? And she said, I don't know anything about engineering. There haven't been really too many students from our school that have done that. Why don't you go take a test? And I went down to Cal State LA and I took a test sponsored by JETS, which is the Junior Engineering and Technology Society. And I did very well on the aptitude test. And then the other part of it was an interest test. And they asked me questions like, have you taken apart a car engine? And the answer was no, I hadn't done those things, right? And so the results came back that I had the aptitude to do it, but they weren't sure I would be interested in it.
And you were interested in it.
I was interested in solving environmental problems, but those questions weren't on the test yet. So it was an interesting moment.
So you mentioned that you went to an all-girls high school, and that's interesting. I guess in some ways you said the advisor knew nothing about engineering, but on the other hand, I imagine it empowered you, or so it's said, that when you're in an all-girls environment. Can you talk a little bit about how that influenced your decision?
Yeah, it definitely did. The high school's in Pasadena, California, and so is Caltech. And as it so happened, a lot of my teachers were wives of Caltech professors, and a lot of them had graduate degrees in science or mathematics in their own right. And so I was able to see excellent science and math coming from women, and it never occurred to me that people even thought that women couldn't do math or
Although
science.
those women had not done it. I mean, they were teaching high school, but they hadn't done what their husbands were doing.
Right, they had followed their husbands to Caltech, but I think as a high school student, I didn't really
make that connection. You thought they had stature, they were your teachers.
Exactly.
Are you in touch with have any of them followed your career? Because they influenced you.
Yeah, and I did see, so Rosa Cooperman was my chemistry teacher in high school, and I went back to give a talk, and she came to that, and it was really nice to get to visit with her. And in fact, yeah, they have been
watching you from the sidelines, so to speak. So you went on to Princeton to study engineering, and I think it's interesting that you had mentioned to me before that the engineering school is sort of on the outskirts, a little bit off to the side of campus. That's still the case?
Yes, yeah, it's located on the edge of campus.
Did you feel that you were to some extent a little bit marginal within the Princeton zeitgeist, or whatever you want to call it?
I think there was a little bit of that culturally. Engineering is something like 20% of the student population, or was when I was there. So we were a sizable minority, but definitely it is a liberal arts university, and you get the feeling that engineering has to position itself within that larger framework.
Did you feel that was a good thing? I mean, looking back at your education, you went on to Carnegie Mellon for your PhD, which is much more a traditional engineering school. Yes. So thinking about the two places, now I know one was an undergraduate, one was graduate school. Can you talk a little bit to that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt like I had done things in the right order, in that my undergraduate degree was very much, for me, an exploration. I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to do engineering, and that's part of why I chose Princeton. I knew that I could get an excellent education in another field. If I chose to do, say, politics or government, I could do that at Princeton. So, and I did try as much as I could to take advanced classes in other disciplines. So it's often a strategic thing that engineers do, to take the easiest social science class to meet the
I know an
requirement.
engineer who did that at Princeton, so he could graduate summa cum laude.
Right, and I didn't, for whatever reason, I didn't care. I knew I had excellent faculty across lots of fields. I was somewhat interested in religions of late antiquity. I took 3 classes in that, and I was just able to jump into a 300 level class. And I'm not sure why they let me do that, because I didn't have a lot of the prerequisites, but they made me feel welcome, and I always appreciated that. And then I would go over to, say, my thermodynamics class at Princeton in engineering, and they would make us feel like we didn't belong, even though we had all the prerequisites. We had the math, we'd had the chemistry.
And do you think that's pretty much par for the course in many engineering
It's
programs?
absolutely
Did
the
you find it in
method.
Carnegie Mellon? Did you teach actually? Were you a teaching assistant there?
So I did teach at Carnegie Mellon, and I found Carnegie Mellon to actually have more variety. So I had, some of it was happenstance, that every professor I had in chemical engineering at Princeton was fairly far along in their career, and they had a very traditional way of teaching. They had these yellowed notes that were decades old. They would take the notes in and put what was in the notes on the board. We put what was on the board in our notes. Carnegie Mellon had more variety, and I noticed there was more active learning and more attention to teaching and learning in the classes that I happened to be taking at Carnegie Mellon. I think there was still plenty of traditional education.
So you really
on.
got a good combination of resources to draw on, so that when you began to do thinking about your career beyond graduate school, you became involved in engineering education. And you wrote this book, Engineering and Social Justice, which is such a dramatic title in a way. I mean, it is dramatic. And in it, you take on a range of issues that you feel have never been addressed in engineering courses. And one of the things that struck me was, for example, you talk about an engineering mindset. First of all, I guess I'd like you to define what the engineering mindset is, in your opinion.
Yeah, so I was very careful to talk about mindsets in engineering. So I'm trying not to characterize a single engineering mindset. And the reason I don't want to do that is because I don't want engineers to feel like they must be this way. So there is a normative expectation that engineers maintain this mindset, but I wanted to open up the possibility that while some engineers have this mindset, other engineers don't have to, right? And so the way I tried to characterize the mindset was through jokes people tell about the profession. So,
you have a whole section on jokes and giving engineering jokes, and then you take them, you deconstruct them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Please give us some examples.
So one of the jokes is about a guillotine, and the joke goes that there's a priest, a lawyer, and an engineer that are set to be executed by guillotine. The priest is on the chopping block, executioner pulls the cord, and nothing happens. And the priest yells, "Divine intervention, you have to let me go." And they let the priest go. And the lawyer's on the chopping block, and the executioner pulls the cord, nothing happens. And the lawyer says, "Double jeopardy, you have to let me go." And they say, "Well, okay, you can go." And then the engineer's on the chopping block, and the executioner's getting ready to pull the cord. And the engineer says, "Wait, I think I see your problem." And it illustrates these things about engineers. I mean, it celebrates that engineers want to be helpful.
Yeah.
They can solve problems.
But the context is missing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The big picture is out, even at the expense of their own life. They're not questioning what the state is doing. They're completely cooperative.
And I guess, I mean, it does seem to me that it's the idea of bringing a humanities orientation into engineering, and the two have traditionally been partitioned. So do you think that your Princeton education, or you think wherever you would have gone, you would have sought out that other piece? Or do you think it was serendipity that made you see that piece that might be missing within engineering?
I think that based on my high school education, I think that they instilled in me a kind of critical thinking that I brought to my education at Princeton. And there was one teacher that I'm going to get emotional about talking about him because he was so influential. His name was Gerald Fallon. He taught me English in 7th grade, Latin in 8th grade, and ancient history in 9th grade. And what he did with us through those different subjects always was challenging assumptions and teaching us to think critically. And one of the things that I saw him again over the holiday break, after my first semester at Princeton, and he encouraged us to think about our education broadly, that it wasn't necessarily just what was happening in our classrooms, that it was the whole of our education that mattered, and that it mattered if we went to the afternoon talk, or it mattered if we joined a club on campus. And so I did start to think about my education in that holistic way because of him.
I want to talk about your second book, Engineering Thermodynamics and 21st Century Energy Problems, which is a mouthful.
It is.
But nonetheless, in this book you say that you want professors to begin their courses by posing the question, why are you taking this course?
Yes.
Which I think is sort of revolutionary, especially for engineering. I do it in my literature courses. Why are you taking a course on War and Peace? And they say, well, I always wanted to say I wanted to read War and Peace. But when you ask that of students in a class like this, first of all, what kinds of answers do you get? And what kinds of answers would you like to get?
So I started doing this as an experiment when I was teaching at Smith College. And what was interesting was a lot of students would say, it's expected. And it would lead into a story about their families. So if they had come from a privileged family where parents had gone to college, it was a hard expectation that they also would go to college. If they were first in their family to go to college, it was also a hard expectation that they would go to college because the parents said, you need this education because I didn't have it and I wish I had had it. So they often told those stories, and the different stories would come from, Smith has a program called the Ada Comstock Scholars, and these are alternatively aged students. They're often students who have done other things in their lives up to a point. Maybe they went to community college before coming to Smith, and they have a very clear sense of purpose. And
did a lot of those Ada Comstock students go into the engineering program?
We always had a couple. So there were one or two in every class that I taught. And so they were really helpful to the conversation because they would be able to articulate why they wanted to do engineering. And they had a very clear sense about it. But we would often get stories about, well, I need a good job, right? And engineering is going to give me a good job. And I would push back on that. Just check on that. Like, is that the only way to get a good job?
Was that the principal answer that you got to get
Often,
a good job?
Yes. It was a very careerist type of answer. So I would push back on it, and we would talk about it. And I wanted them to have an intrinsic motivation that was beyond expectations placed on them by parents or other people in their lives, and that was something beyond, well, I have to do this, otherwise I won't, succeed, which is also somewhat external.
Right.
And so I encouraged them to do that, and they would usually write a reflection after that initial discussion in class, which would always be sort of first day of class in the fall semester after they'd been away for summer. So I wanted them to take a moment to reflect.
And you also would ask questions like, what is energy? Why is it important? I wonder if you got some blanks on that. Those are fundamental questions for a course in thermodynamics, and yet I wonder, did they answer that with alacrity, or did they find themselves a little stymied?
Both. So some would go back to their physics class, right? And so they had learned something about energy and work and force times distance. So I would sometimes get a very physics-based answer to the question.
Technical response,
Yes. So that was often, they had memorized that so they could repeat that. But then sometimes less so. But what would come out of that conversation was that they all had, the reason I wanted to talk about energy and not thermodynamics is that energy is something everybody has experience with. Everybody flips a light switch. Everybody's interacting with energy in their everyday life. whether it's public transportation or starting a car or a lawnmower or anything.
So it's
right?
context again. I mean, it's that idea of broadening beyond just the narrow focus on the field.
And it's also empowerment, because if you have a day-to-day interaction with something, you know something about it. And I wanted to impress upon them that this was not an esoteric subject that they knew nothing about and therefore had to rely on me for. This was something that they actually did have some practical knowledge of.
Yeah, I think it's great. When you went into engineering, I assume, especially at Princeton, that you were one of the few women in that program. And that's changed.
Yes.
How much has it changed? Do you feel that it's changing as we speak? And what impact has more women in the field had on the field, in your view?
So for me, one of the things, I'm exactly the age where there had just been an increase. So in the engineering college at Princeton, it was 20% women. That was about the national average in 1993 when I graduated. That is still the national average today.
Really?
So the undergraduate population has not changed very much. And it's also true in sort of occupational data that women that are working as engineers, it was something like 9% when I graduated, and I think it's 12% or something now. It's not that much higher. And so it's stagnated somewhat. And so there's lots of theories about why that is. But there's an idea that once you get over about a third, you reach a tipping point and you start to get more. And when you get 30%, you get 40% all of a sudden.
I think that happened in medicine, in where there was, and then now it's more or less 50, if not more, women.
Yeah, and so people told me when I was an undergrad, just wait, it's going to happen. You're going to have all, by the time
but it
I'm my age,
happened.
Right? It was supposed to have, the tipping point was supposed to have been reached.
So what is? I guess there are lots of theories about this. Why do you think it is that it hasn't?
It's a combination of things. I think it is that we have fixed, one of the problems we fixed is access to mathematics in K-12. So more women are taking calculus, but they aren't choosing engineering, even though they are eligible for it. And so that has to do with gender stereotypes, gender normativities, expectations of what women are supposed to do. And so how you counter that is a culture shift, and those are always the hardest things to enact.
Yeah, the math issue, I think, goes way back, and there have been real efforts to change it, but I don't know if it has changed appreciably, that women girls veer away from math.
Right, and some of my students at Smith would describe, they would take calculus, and some of their calculus teachers in high schools, even today, would say, you don't belong here, what are you doing here, you're not.
But a school like Smith, of course, an all-female school with an engineering college, I guess founded about 20 years ago, is really a pioneer in that respect. The only all-female school that has an engineering undergraduate.
And Sweetbriar, yeah.
And Sweetbriar, that's right, which is interesting. I find it interesting as a literature professor who shares a lot of the ideas that you have, but I look at your books and the way they're organized is very engineering-like. And I wonder about that. Is that, do you think, built into the field or into your mindset? Again, it's very... How would you describe it?
The sections are numbered.
The sections are numbered.
Right.
And do you feel that that's basic to getting the attention of engineers, and you feel that you need to do it that way for them to take you seriously?
Yes, I think for that audience, and particularly the thermodynamics book, both of them are written for students. And so the thermodynamics book is written as a textbook companion. And so it was sort of carefully thought through in that it's an ebook, so it's free on any campus that subscribes to the Morgan and Claypool Library. And so I thought, well, I can't really write an alternative textbook. What could I do that would actually enable this to infuse? And also, say I do write an alternative textbook, who's going to use it?
Right.
So these textbooks, and understand, so one of the books I taught, this is just an interesting little anecdote, but when I picked up the book at Smith, first semester I taught thermodynamics, it was a book called Smith and Van Ness. My father, who was also a chemical engineer, remember, he has Smith, 1942. You open the two books, and I was teaching in 2001, the 2001 edition of Smith and Van Ness and the 1942 edition of Smith read exactly the same. And the idea is, well, thermodynamics doesn't change. This book is just as good. And they added sections and new problems and so on. But the basic text explaining the material is identical. And it was shocking to me that engineering education had not thought about how do we present this material better to students.
Is that text still used?
I believe so, yeah.
So you need to supplant that text.
Well, I'd like to, but I realized that the way textbook companies work too, people go to Wiley and they go to McGraw-Hill, And there may be Prentice Hall. There's sort of 2 or 3 textbook companies that engineering is served by, and each of those has a series, and you pick from those series. And so unless I was going to place it in there,
it's the politics of textbook. I mean, that's a whole subject in itself, and I've spoken to people about that.
Absolutely.
So what about, I take it you're working on something now. Are you? And have you thought about writing a book that would maybe not be a textbook, but that would just take on this larger issue of engineering education in a way that faculty and other educated people would want to read?
Well, so I thought about a second edition of Engineering and Social Justice. So that's a field that has grown quite a lot in the last 10 years. And that's been really gratifying to kind of see people are asking that question. How do you put these 2 things together? And when I wrote it, that title actually came from the publisher. The publisher said, you have to use this title. I had a much more unwieldy academic title for the thing.
I love that title.
It was brilliant because he said, well, everybody's searching Google now. You need something that they can find with keywords. This is about engineering and social justice, so do that. And it really did, I wrote it to be a primer, a first book that someone in engineering who has an interest in social justice could read. And that's really the position I was in as a student, was I was doing activism on campus. I was interested in improving the status of women at Princeton, for example, and I served on both a university committee and I was involved in the Women's Center on campus. But I couldn't bring that into the engineering building. It was, geographically separate from campus, and also it didn't contain any of the flyers for activist events happening, whereas the other academic buildings did. So there was a clear message about kind of a depoliticization within the engineering college.
And with environmental engineering now, that has sort of exploded as an area. Here at Drexel, we have peace engineering as an area. That's relatively new? Are you involved with that in any way?
I've met Mira because Mira came to a conference. So there's an annual conference on engineering, social justice, and peace that happens, that's been happening since 2004. And in fact, the textbook, Engineering and Social Justice, evolved because Caroline Bailey, who was then at Queen's University in Canada, had pulled together a group of people to talk about engineering and social justice, and she was the editor of the book series and invited me to write a book. And at the time, I was focused on critical pedagogies at Smith. So I thought, well, I'm at a liberal arts institution. What was it about Elaine Pagel's class that made me feel so at home? And I asked a friend of mine who was a sociologist, and she said, oh, you have to read Bell Hooks's book, Teaching to Transgress. So I picked that up.
Wow.
And because I'm at Smith, of course, Bell Hooks happens to come give a talk that semester, and I'm able to talk to her because it's a small enough school. And she said, whatever you do, promise me you'll write what you do, because there are other scientists who've used critical pedagogy, but they haven't written about it. Please write. So I agreed to do that, promised Bell Hooks, so I had to do it. And I wrote about it. And so it was through that I went to this conference on engineering and social justice and got invited to write this book.
So it seems, I mean, you said that we've reached a sort of stagnant point in terms of women in engineering, but I wonder with the environmental awareness and the kinds of awareness that you have, if we've reached, we're about to enter a new ascendancy.
Yes.
And I wonder where you think we are, where you think we're going in the next 10 years in engineering.
So the climate crisis is the thing that comes up immediately for me. We've got about 10 years to seriously do something, and it requires fundamentally changing aspects of our infrastructure. Engineers have to be involved in the response to climate. And we can be involved preventively or we can be involved in disaster response, but either way, engineers are going to be involved. And I think it really is past time that we
It's not just about tweaking the guillotine that's going to kill us, right?
That's right. And it's not just environmental engineers that need to be part of that. It's the electrical engineers. It's everything about our data systems. It's everything about how we build our roads. It's everything. And so it's transportation systems, not just roads. You've got to get bigger. It's systems of systems. How do our roads interact with the electrical grid? And so all of those things have to be rethought, and immediately.
And humanistic engineers could go to the forefront of leading this revolution of awareness, I really think. And I do want to put in a statement that we have a dean of engineering, a female dean of engineering, who is an environmental engineer at Drexel, who I think is very tuned into these things. And she was part of the reason why you're here today.
Yes.
So you're optimistic about the future, but not just engineering, but in terms of, I guess, the state of education, because that's what you're very involved in.
I'm not optimistic about the future of
Are you
higher
not
education.
pessimistic?
So I guess that what I would say is that I'm concerned about trends in higher education. I'm concerned about access and affordability. I'm concerned about how we answer that as a nation. I'm concerned that we've lost valuing public goods. We no longer think about the social good that higher education brings, or that even K-12 education brings. And we need to really be focused on quality and not just on something like a narrow conception of workforce preparation.
And careerism and statistics and
Exactly.
yes.
It's not about preparing people for jobs, not K-12 and not higher ed. It's about forming whole people. And if we don't get back to the business of doing that, I think we are really in danger as a society.
I think you're so right, and I think you are so eloquent, and I'm so pleased to have you here, and I hope you continue to write and speak about this very important subject.
Thanks.
So thank you for being here today, and thank you for joining us on the Civil Discourse.